Also joining us this morning is Matthew Chase, Executive Director of the National Association of Counties. Matt Chase began serving as Executive Director in September 2012. Prior to becoming NACO's 5th Executive Director, Matt served nearly a decade as Executive Director of the National Association of Development Organization, NADO, which represents local government-based regional planning and developmental organization. Matt believes that county leaders and an active NACO membership are essential in preparing America for a better future. Since becoming Executive Director, he has partnered with his Executive Committee, Board of Directors, and committed leadership to bring an infusion of enthusiasm, new ideas, and emphasis on collaboration with affiliates and state associations. Just one example of NACO's new approach is the Why Counties Matter campaign launched during the 2013 NACO Legislative Conference. The campaign aims to make certain that the administration, Congress, and the American people gain a better understanding and appreciation of county government. This effort ties into NACO's new focus on policy and practitioner research, especially data and facts that tell the county story and demonstrate the impact of counties on the economic and social fabric of our communities. Matt is a graduate of Harvard College in Osceola County, New York, and holds a master's degree in political management from George Washington University. He resides in Northern Virginia with his wife, Shanna, and their 2 young boys. So please welcome Matt Chase. Matt.
Good morning. Good morning. Need to change that from Northern Virginia to Arlington. Absolutely. So it's a great honor to be here, and I know the last speaker of your conference, so I am going to try and be brief. And I want to thank the president here for that kind introduction, and thank Jim Campbell for asking me to come down here. It's really been a wonderful experience. But now I'm starting to question that they put me on after an hour-and-a-half ethics training. So have the guy from DC come down, sit through ethics training, and then give a speech. I think there's a little message there. So anyways, what I want to do today is talk a little bit about just NACO. You heard from our president, Linda Langston, yesterday. I don't want to spend too much time on that. But I do want to talk about what is going on in our political environment, what's going on with federal debt and deficits, what is some of our immediate priorities, and how we can get engaged. So when you're talking about inside the Beltway, you really have to be resilient, as Linda was talking about. So I always like to think, are you an optimist or a pessimist? It depends on the context. If you're pouring water, the glass is half full. If you're drinking, it's half empty. And I think that's kind of how we think about DC nowadays. You got to figure out what is it? Are we on the upswing or the downswing? So I'm going to go through a little bit what is going on in the nation's capital and how it impacts you. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through a couple things quickly. So we do represent the 3,069 counties and parishes across the country. We've got 75% are dues-paying members. In the great Commonwealth of Virginia, we have 91 out of 95 members. We've got wonderful board representation and a partnership with VACO. And we've got Harrison Moody, who's going to be your incoming president on our board, and Jerry Highland from Fairfax. And Phyllis from VACO represents the county attorneys from across the country on our board. And Greg Castano from Arlington County represents the national affiliate for County Volunteer Services. So we have good representation. And you also are using our programs, whether it's the legislative research, our medical prescription drug program. You've helped your citizens save about $14 million. We've just launched some new additional services related to vision and other things, and we encourage you to take a look at it. I've been at NACO for about a year, and we went through a strategic planning process, and we were really looking at what is it that we wanted to do. And the number one charge for us is to make counties more relevant in the federal public policy arena, to really get you engaged in our committees, to see what your priorities are, and to develop forward-thinking, proactive solutions at the federal level. And so we're really working on that, and I'll get into it in a second. We're really focused on you as individuals, as county leaders. What are the skills that you need as individuals? When I grew up, my father was a district attorney and a judge, and I know what it's like. Maybe my name wasn't on the ballot, but I understood every morning our family got up, we got the local newspaper, We had to see what was written that day about the trial that was going on, about the activities of the community, so that when I went to school or went to the grocery store, I could be prepared. And I do remember at the end of my father's life, he stopped going to the grocery store. It just got so nasty towards the end. So I really come to this job with a lot of passion and personal experience, recognizing what you as elected leaders go through and the skill sets that you need. And when I think back how the number one rule in our family was never get in a fight with the publisher of the newspaper because they bought the ink, now all it takes is one citizen and a laptop in a basement to really make things difficult. And so that requires different skill sets and approaches. So that's some of the things that we're looking at. We're really looking at counties as institutions and what can we do to provide first-class, world-class services. And as the President talked about, we are really looking at public awareness, and I'll talk about that in a second. And of course, none of this matters if we're not good stewards of our intellectual, human, and financial resources of our membership and our association. So that's kind of our building blocks as we move forward. So one of the things we've done, you saw the video yesterday on why counties matter, so I'm not going to harp on it too much. But what we're talking about here is how are we branding counties nationally as if we were a single company in a way with 3,069 branches. And when you start to think about the collective power that we have with over 19,000 local elected officials just on the commissioner and county executive side, not including all the row officers or constitutional officers, but you start to think of counties nationally, we're essentially a $500 billion a year industry with 3.3 million employees. Essentially, over 1% of the U.S. population works for county government, and far more families rely on the pay and benefits that counties provide, in addition to the public services. So we want to be able to tell our story from a national perspective that we are a force, that we're a big organization with a lot of moving parts, but that when you talk about the fundamental building blocks for our communities, it starts with county government. When you talk about roads, counties, maybe not in this state, but 45% of American roads are owned by counties, 228,000 bridges, 900 hospitals, especially those with critical care and access, 75% of the public nursing homes. Not to mention that we invest $70 billion a year in the criminal justice system through the jails, sheriffs, courts, and other things, and 13 million inmates a year. So we just want to start with some of the fundamental building blocks of the community and really articulate that when NACO takes a position on a federal piece of legislation or regulations, we're not doing it as Democrats or Republicans, we're doing it as county governments who are tasked with providing services at the local level. And we really need to articulate why we're taking those positions. Otherwise, they get taken out of context. That we're not doing it just because we want to take these positions, we're doing it because we're mandated or required to provide these services. Skip through this one, actually. So, let's see here. My apologies. Let me shift a little bit to the national political landscape. And what we're dealing with is what folks perceive as really a dysfunctional Congress administration. And that is true. And I'm going to walk through some of the statistics of why that's true. But when it comes to our agenda, a lot of things are moving. And so there might be gridlock at the 60,000-foot level in some of the big pieces of legislation. But a lot of the rules and regulations we work on, a lot of the reauthorization bills we deal with are still moving through the process. So we need to be front and center. But when we step back and look at the national political landscape, really what is happening is significant metropolitan growth. We're seeing a purple nation, as the gentleman talked about yesterday in Virginia politics. Everybody talks about red and blue, but what we're really seeing is purple. The uncertainty of the economic situation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what redistricting is doing to the Congress. So a little over a year ago, we had a presidential election, seems like a decade ago. And everybody saw this map, and everybody focused on the 11 key states, the battleground states for the election. And really what happened was it was 11 states that everybody focused on, and that shifted the power to the president for his re-election. But the reality is it wasn't about 11 states. There were really about 11 counties within those states that actually determined the presidential election. And Virginia is a classic example with Fairfax and some of the other independent cities. But when you think about President Jimmy Carter, when he won his first time, or only time, he won 297 electoral votes, and that took 1,711 counties for him to get elected. And you can see up there all those. President Obama won re-election with more electoral votes, and yet only 690 counties out of 3,069. That is the concentration of population on the two coasts and in the industrial Midwest, as you can see. But when you really step back and you start to look at it, and NACO needs to do this from a national perspective, those counties in red, Mitt Romney actually outperformed John McCain. More folks in those counties voted Republican in this last presidential election than voted against President Obama, or with President Obama. This is where the president, in these little blue, you can hardly see him, where he outperformed himself from 4 years prior. And yet, he still had a landslide victory. If you want to look at it from a county lens, you can see here, red counties, Mitt Romney won, the blue ones, President Obama won. Didn't take a lot of counties to win re-election. But from our perspective, when we look at it from advocating for counties at the federal level, we look at this map, which is really purple. A lot of those counties are very close. And so this is really important, I think, from our perspective. Because the reality is, while the political parties dominate, more Americans now actually identify themselves as independents than they do either political party. Yet 40% of Americans now say they are independent, one of the highest rates in recent decades. So, as we deal with our issues, the economy is still front and center. We've got unemployment at about 7.4%. It is going down, but in the recent months it's been very stubborn. What is even worse than the 7.4% unemployment is this chart here, where you can see of the unemployed, 37% have now been out of work for over 27 weeks. And that's why that 7.4% is so stubborn. It's this part of the unemployed that have lost their skills, they've lost their connection to the workforce, and they are continuing to struggle to re-enter. Because all these companies became so efficient and their productivity levels went through the roof during the recession, and so they don't use many workers, and therefore this particular piece of the population, or segment of the population, is struggling to get back in. And as counties that provide social services, this is the group that we're dealing with most often. So we just want to point that out. I want to just real quickly go through what's going on in the House and Senate, and we talk about gridlock, and I think it's important to understand why. If you look at the United States Senate, the Democrats have a 4-seat majority, and they rely on 2 independents for that majority. But what's happened is, this graph here is a little tough to read, but if you look at the bottom chart, you can basically see there's no blue over on the red side and no red over on the blue side. What that means is both political parties are wedged in and locked into their party votes. This means that there aren't any senators crossing the aisle to vote with the other party. Where in 1994, you could see that there were actually a lot of moderate Republicans and more conservative Democrats that crossed the aisle. And it's hard to believe we're already talking about November 2014, but I just said the Democrats control the Senate. The reality is, in the last 2 elections, they should have captured the majority in the U.S. Senate. The playing field was so far in their advantage. The last election, the Democrats had 23 seats to defend. Republicans only had 10. And yet, they still couldn't capture the majority. Some of it was inter-party fighting. Some of it was just some of the candidates made some dumb decisions toward the end. And as we look forward in this next election, the Republicans should recapture the Senate. This will be their 3rd cycle where they have a great opportunity to recapture it. You only have one Republican, Susan Collins from Maine, who is running in the state that President Obama carried, but you got 7 Senate Democrats running in states that Mitt Romney won and won overwhelmingly. And that's going to be very interesting to see how the Democrats hold on to those seats. But South Dakota, North Carolina, West Virginia, some of these states should really be automatic pickups for the Republicans, so we'll see what happens there. On the House side, Republicans have a 16-seat majority. And again, they should retain that majority moving forward, and a lot of it is through redistricting. If you listen to a lot of the pundits, one of the things they'll tell you about the House is it's become more dysfunctional because of the rise of the Tea Party, because the conservatives in the House won't bend. That's partially true. That might even be the majority. But at the same time, the Democratic caucus has actually become more liberal than the Republicans have become conservative. You don't hear that in the media very often. But if you look at the voting, and if you look at the way the districts are now created, and you go back to 1998 to today, and you look at how solid Democrat the districts are, how solid Republicans, Democratic districts have actually become more Democratic. And some of that is because in redistricting, Republicans wanted to pick up some extra seats. They have very slim majorities or control in those seats, where they made, especially the minority House districts, much more concentrated. And so a lot of this dysfunction is actually attributed to both sides. That's my point. And that is important for us to remember. So when you have 435 seats of the U.S. House, and only 66 of them can be labeled as somewhat competitive, it's really tough to govern. And you can look at this chart here. Again, 435 members of the House, only 66 are somewhat competitive. There's only 9 seats that are a toss-up, that you really can't predict who is going to win. That is incredible. When I started lobbying 20 years ago, you would have 115, 120 competitive seats easily. And now we're only down to 66, and each election cycle gets fewer and fewer and fewer. So as we look forward to this next election next November, the party of the president in the second term usually doesn't fare too well. So if you look at George W. Bush, the Republicans lost 30 seats. I would suspect this November it'll be more like Bill Clinton, it'll be more like Bill Clinton, where the Democrats really, they won't lose as many as they should. And that goes back to that redistricting. So let me, in my last 10 minutes here, I want to move quickly. We're talking a lot about deficit and debt. And I heard some of your speakers cover this before. But I do want to give you a couple statistics so you understand the context of why we're dealing with federal debt and deficit. But I can't talk about the debt without talking about Will Rogers. So he said Alexander Hamilton started the U.S. Treasury with nothing, and that was the closest we've ever been to being even. So basically, why are we talking about deficit and debt? Debt is what we've accumulated since the day one of the country. Well, from 1790 to 1982, we accumulated $1 trillion in debt. It took us 190 years, World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Civil War, War of 1812, you name it. It took us 190 years, essentially, to accumulate $1 trillion in debt. And then in the last couple of years, we've actually been averaging that each year. That's why there's a problem. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. Please don't raise your hand. But if I was outside talking to you and having coffee, and I would talk to you about deficit and debt, I could tell if you watch Fox News, CNN, or MSNBC. I mean, it's pretty simple. And I would say, what has caused the deficit and the recent deficits in the debt? And if you listen to Fox, you would say spending is out of control. If you listen to CNN, you might say, it's both. And if you listen to MSNBC, you would say, well, revenues have plummeted. The reality is, they're all right. And what this chart is showing you, if you look to the far right, is at the same time our expenses exploded with TARP and some of these other things, which we've actually are now making money on, thanks to Freddie and Fannie Mae, our revenues plummeted at the exact same time. So both sides are actually right. And so now we're entering a period where both sides in the last couple of weeks are starting to talk about compromise. And we'll see if it actually happens. But we had the staff director of the Senate Budget Committee in our office the other day talking to our staff. And it does look like there's some incremental progress being made. And both sides realize that nobody won the shutdown. And as Senator Reid's staff said, the Democrats may have lost, but we didn't, or the Republicans may have lost in the House on the shutdown, but we certainly didn't win. And so there's a clear recognition that both sides didn't look too well. The other thing that's happened in the last 9 months, our deficits have come down dramatically, almost in half. The economy is picking up, especially on the corporate taxes and individual tax, and things are looking better, even though the unemployment rate is still very stubborn. So what do we have to look forward from a county perspective? I'm going to skip through some of this. We have a very serious agenda, and we call it the triple threat. So counties are really facing three major issues. And when I say major, these are in the billions, not the millions and hundreds of millions. First one is federal tax reform. We have some things I'll get into on tax and municipal bond that the numbers will blow you away. And this is a serious issue. The House Majority Leader Cantor has been very helpful to us on this. The tax and municipal bonds are on the table where they actually want to repeal them or roll back the benefit to state and local and to communities because they need the money. But our view is tax and municipal bonds should be taken off the table because it's an intergovernmental partnership where governments don't tax each other. And municipal bonds are not a special carve-out. It's actually been in the first IRS tax code in 1912, when the tax code was 23 pages. One of the provisions was tax and municipal bonds, and I'll get into that in a second. But also they're looking at the ability of citizens to no longer deduct property tax on their federal income tax. They're looking at sales tax, which is a big deal in 7 states, or income tax. And so we've got a lot going on tax reform. We also have big deal on entitlement reform, which isn't as prominent here, but we have 21 states where counties actually pay a portion of the Medicare share for states, the state share for Medicaid, I'm sorry. And so if you're in California, we have counties that literally spend, LA County spends $5 billion a year on the state share of Medicaid. So when you hear NACO getting involved in healthcare, it's because those 21 states, counties actually pay a part of the state share. And in Florida, New York, California, and many other states, it's a huge problem. And then we have 37 states where by state constitutional law, you have to provide indigent care. And so we don't want to see these block grants where they're basically capping the federal share and forcing you to increase property tax to pay the federal and state match. And then sequestration, you had folks talking about that, so I won't go into too much, except to say the important thing on sequestration to remember, it's not a one-year process, it's a 10-year process. The budget caps for the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee are locked in right as of today for the next 10 years. And so there will be a lot of pain. So basically, these federal agencies, especially the state and local block grant programs, will not see a pay raise for 10 years. They're locked in. And what's worse is there'll be cuts because the federal agencies will have to increase rent, they'll have to increase their health care costs and their salary employee costs. Therefore, there'll be a lot less money over the next 10 years to sub-allocate to the state and local governments. Which brings us to regulatory reform. That this is the reality, we understand the budget situation, and therefore we are working with the Office of Management and Budget in the White House on regulatory reform. I will tell you, Penny Gross sat on a conference call several months ago with Office of Management and Budget's regulatory review director, and he couldn't get off the phone fast enough because we had 3 county supervisors that knew the federal rules and regulations better than they did, citing law, code, verse, to where the commas were and the periods were in sentences. And afterwards they called me back and said, next time we will be much more prepared. And it was wonderful to see that they knew we live this stuff. You guys live this stuff every day. This isn't just academic theory. And so our work on regulatory reform, I think, is one of our most important activities right now. We know we're not going to get more dollars. And so how are we going to make the system work better so that you have more flexibility? So just to wrap up here pretty quick, tax reform is huge. And why state and local are on the chopping block is because we're a big number. It's where they can get savings. So if you look at the major tax expenditures in the federal code, employer health is the #1 tax benefit, that you don't pay taxes on your health premiums. Second is capital gains, and third are state and local tax deductions. So it's not like members of Congress are targeting us because they don't like state and local. It's the only way they can achieve savings. And that's why folks are saying, are you kidding me? They're going to attack municipal bonds. There's no way. Yes, there is a way because they need the revenue. Now, let me just wrap up quickly on this tax-exempt municipal bonds. The number one use is K through 12 school construction. In the last 10 years in this country, we built $512 billion in K through 12 school construction with tax-exempt municipal bonds. The number two use is hospitals. Number three use is water and sewer. You can get way down on that list of 55,000 projects every year, or 6,600 projects every year, and you might have a sports stadium or something like that that the press will focus on. But the vast majority are schools, hospitals, jails, libraries, water and sewer, and airports. So what are we talking about? Well, the president has put out a proposal based on the Simpson-Bowles Commission that says, let's scale it back. A full repeal, as proposed by Simpson-Bowles, would cost state and local governments $495 billion over 10 years. $495 billion over 10 years in increased interest payments. If we get caught into the wealthy dynamic and they put a 28% cap, that's going to cost us $173 billion in increased interest payments if we look back the last 10 years in projects. So when folks ask why are we working on this, when you get into Virginia, in the last 10 years, Virginia has built $25 billion in public sector projects with tax-exempt municipal bonds. So if there was a repeal of that tax-exempt interest, it would cost the state and your taxpayers $7.7 billion. A cap would be 2.7. So all that new money you just put in your transportation system would be a drop in the bucket to the $7.7 billion in interest payments you'd be paying on schools, hospitals, airports, and other infrastructure. So we have a lot of information on it, and we appreciate your time. We do have customized data. We also welcome the opportunity to work with you. And you've got a very powerful congressional delegation, whether it's Mr. Cantor or Congressman Goodlatte, who oversees the Judiciary Committee and has been a huge, it's going to be a central player in the Marketplace Fairness Act. Congressman Frank Wolf oversees the Justice Department funding and is huge on state and local criminal justice. You have a really influential delegation, and we want to make sure we're partnering with you. So I've run out of time. I guess I could take one or two questions, and I just really appreciate the time.